I still remember the exact sound of my suitcase wheels echoing through the stone walkway that led to the college gates. Each turn of those wheels carried a heartbeat of hope and fear, and I couldn't tell which one was louder. I had imagined this day so many times, standing here, finally free, finally somewhere new. But now that I was, my chest felt tight, my throat dry. For years, I had dreamed of being just another student, another name on a class list, another face in a crowd. Yet deep down, I knew that wasn't my story. The campus was alive with energy, laughter spilling from open windows, the hum of conversation, the smell of coffee drifting from a nearby cafe. Students hugged friends they hadn't seen all summer, dragging suitcases and memories into dorms that would soon hold late-night talks and whispered dreams. I stood still for a moment, letting the scene soak into me. I wanted to belong here. I wanted this to be the place where I could start over. My name is Alex Morgan. I've spent most of my life hiding parts of myself from others, sometimes from myself too. I was born different, in a way the world doesn't always understand. Intersex. The word used to terrify me, like a secret that could ruin everything if spoken aloud. For years, I tucked it away behind polite smiles and quiet conversations, pretending it didn't matter. But pretending is exhausting. It's like holding your breath underwater, waiting for permission to rise. As I crossed the courtyard, clutching my admission folder, I told myself this was the start of something better. A chance to breathe again. A chance to live as me, even if I wasn't sure what that fully meant yet. The dorm room smelled faintly of lavender and new paint. One bed was already claimed, a neatly folded blanket, a photo of a dog, and a half-unpacked suitcase gave it away. My soon-to-be roommate appeared a few minutes later, hair pulled into a messy bun, and a smile so bright it seemed to light up the dull corridor. "Hey, you must be Alex," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Lily Carter, journalism major, caffeine addict, and professional overthinker." I laughed, surprised by how easily her warmth disarmed me. "Nice to meet you. I'm still deciding my major, but I'm pretty sure overthinking will be my minor." Lily laughed, and just like that, some of my nerves melted. We spent the next hour rearranging the furniture, arguing playfully about who got the better side of the room. She talked about her small town in Oregon, her dreams of becoming a writer, and her fear of big cities. I didn't say much, but when she looked at me, I felt she didn't need me to. She had the kind of presence that made silence feel safe. Later that evening, we attended orientation. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy. Rows of students shifted in their seats, whispering, scrolling on phones. The dean gave a long speech about opportunity and responsibility, but my attention drifted to the faculty row on stage. Among them sat a man with kind eyes behind square glasses, his hands clasped in a patient stillness that made him seem detached from the noise around him. When he stood to speak, his voice was calm yet commanding, the kind that made people listen without trying. "My name is Professor James Walker," he said. "I teach ethics and human behavior. College isn't just about learning what's in books. It's about understanding who we are when the world starts to test us." Those words lingered long after the applause faded. Understanding who we are. I didn't know why, but something in that sentence stirred an ache in me, as if he had unknowingly reached into the quiet part of my chest where all my questions lived. That night, as I unpacked my clothes, I caught my reflection in the mirror by the window. The city lights flickered across my face, half in shadow, half in glow. For a moment, I saw both the person I was and the one I was becoming overlapping like two transparent images that hadn't quite aligned. Lily was already asleep, soft music playing from her phone. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts looping between the past I wanted to forget and the future I wasn't sure how to hold. Growing up, every visit to the doctor's office had been a lesson in secrecy. Every form I filled out that asked for M or F was a quiet betrayal of truth. My parents did their best to protect me, but protection sometimes feels like erasure. It was easier for everyone to pretend. Easier until it wasn't. I had fought hard to get here. The scholarships, the essays, the interviews, none of it came easy. But what truly terrified me wasn't the academics or the independence. It was the question that followed me everywhere. What if they find out who I really am? During the second week, I saw Professor Walker again. He was walking across the quad, a stack of papers under one arm, greeting students as they passed. When his eyes met mine, he paused. It wasn't the kind of look that made you want to disappear. It was one that made you feel seen, and I didn't know if I was ready for that. He smiled slightly, a quiet, knowing kind of smile, and continued walking. It lasted only a few seconds, but it unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. Something told me he recognized something in me, not my secret, but my silence. As days passed, I tried to blend in. I laughed with classmates, joined study groups, learned the maze of hallways, and found my favorite corner in the library where the world felt still. Lily and I grew closer. She was sunshine in the gray corners of my thoughts, but sometimes I caught myself drifting away, trapped in the space between fear and hope. One afternoon, after a particularly long lecture, I lingered behind to ask Professor Walker a question about an assignment. Students trickled out until the room was empty. He looked up from his notes as I approached, his expression thoughtful. "Alex, isn't it?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded slowly. "You seem like someone carrying more questions than the ones on this paper." The words caught me off guard. For a moment, I couldn't speak. There was no accusation in his tone, only quiet observation, and it both comforted and frightened me. I managed a small smile. "Maybe I am, but I'm still figuring out the right ones to ask." He returned the smile, then said softly, "Sometimes, finding the right question is harder than finding the answer. My door is always open if you ever want to talk." I thanked him and left, the echo of his voice following me out the door. Something about that brief exchange left an imprint, like the first note of a song I didn't yet know the melody to. Back in my dorm, the sun was setting through the window, spilling gold across the floor. Lily looked up from her desk and asked how my day was. I told her it was fine, but inside I felt something shifting, a small, cautious spark of connection I didn't fully understand yet. That night, as I closed my journal, I wrote a single line before turning off the light. Maybe beginnings aren't about where we arrive, but who finally sees us when we do. And though I didn't know it then, that simple truth would change everything that followed. The days that followed blurred together, classes, assignments, cafeteria noise, and quiet evenings spent beneath the hum of my dorm lamp. I was settling into a rhythm, or at least pretending to. On the surface, I looked like any other student juggling coursework and late-night coffee runs. But beneath that facade lived a constant tension, a low hum of vigilance that never quite left me. I smiled, laughed, and blended in, yet part of me stayed hidden, crouched behind a wall built years ago. Professor Walker's words from our brief exchange echoed in my mind more often than I cared to admit. "My door is always open." He had said it kindly, without judgment, yet something about it lingered. An invitation, a mirror, or maybe a warning. I wasn't sure. I avoided his office for weeks, afraid of what might happen if I stepped through that door. But fate, as it tends to, had other plans. It happened on a gray Thursday afternoon. The sky hung heavy with unfallen rain, and the campus seemed quieter than usual. I was packing my bag after class when I noticed him watching me, not with scrutiny, but with a kind of attentive calm that made me uneasy. When everyone else had left, he approached the desk where I sat, his tone even, polite. "Alex," he said, "could you come by my office for a moment? I'd like to discuss your last essay." There was nothing unusual about his request. Still, my pulse quickened. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course, Professor." The walk down the hall felt longer than it should have. My palms were damp against the strap of my bag, my thoughts circling every possible reason for the meeting. Had I written something wrong? Had my guarded tone in class drawn attention? By the time I reached his office, my heartbeat had climbed into my throat. The room was smaller than I expected, cluttered but warm. Books stacked against the walls, a lamp casting amber light over papers, and the faint scent of old wood and coffee. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." I did, trying to steady my breath. "I read your essay on moral authenticity," he began, folding his hands. You wrote that truth isn't a universal currency. For some, it's a debt they spend a lifetime repaying. That's an unusual line for a first-year student. What made you write it? The question startled me. I hadn't thought much about that line when I wrote it. It had slipped out one night when my guard was low. I hesitated, searching for a safe answer. I guess I've just seen how people hide parts of themselves to fit expectations. Sometimes truth feels like something you can't afford to show. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion but thought. That's a very honest observation. Do you feel that way here? The air seemed to shift. I wanted to look away, but his gaze held mine, not demanding, just steady. Sometimes, I admitted quietly. College is new. It's freedom, but it's also exposure. I'm still learning how much of myself belongs to the world and how much I can keep. He nodded slowly, as if he understood something I hadn't said. Everyone carries something unseen, he said. The trick is learning which parts deserve to be hidden and which ones are meant to be known. Silence filled the room for a moment. My throat tightened. There were so many things I wanted to say, how exhausting it was to filter every sentence, how terrified I was of being found out. But I didn't. I wasn't ready to break the fragile safety of anonymity. He sensed my hesitation. You don't have to tell me anything, he said gently. But know this, whatever you carry, it doesn't make you smaller. Sometimes the very thing you think isolates you becomes the reason someone else feels seen. I swallowed hard, staring at the edge of his desk. His words were too kind, too piercing. They found the cracks I'd spent years plastering over. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of rain began tapping against the window, soft but insistent. It felt like the world was waiting. Finally, I took a breath that trembled on the way out. There's something about me, I said quietly, that people usually don't understand. Something that makes me different. His expression didn't change, but the warmth in his eyes deepened. Different how? The question was simple, but it felt like a door creaking open. I hesitated. The old fear surged. The fear of recoil, of confusion, of pity. My hands clenched in my lap. I'm intersex, I said, the word leaving my lips in a whisper. It sounded both fragile and defiant in the still air. It's not something I talk about. I learned a long time ago that most people don't want to hear it. He didn't move, didn't blink in discomfort. He simply nodded once, absorbing the confession as if it were no heavier than any truth worth holding. Thank you for trusting me, he said softly. That must not be easy. A small, bitter laugh escaped me. It's not. It never has been. Does anyone here know? Just my roommate, I said. And I'm not even sure she fully understands. He leaned forward slightly. Alex, listen to me. You don't owe your story to anyone. But you also don't have to hide it like a wound. People will surprise you. Some will not understand, but some will. And those people will matter. For the first time, I looked at him without fear. You make it sound simple. It's not, he admitted with a faint smile. But it's worth it. There was something profoundly human about the way he said it, something that went beyond teacher and student. I realized then that he wasn't offering sympathy. He was offering recognition, the kind that makes a person feel less like an exception and more like a possibility. The rain had strengthened, drumming steadily against the window. I felt lighter, though nothing about my life had changed. Maybe it was the relief of being seen, or maybe it was the way his presence didn't demand anything of me. He stood and walked to the shelf, pulling down a thin, weathered book. This helped me once, he said, handing it to me. It's about courage, the quiet kind, not the kind that shouts. Read it when you can. I took it, unsure of what to say. Thank you, Professor. He nodded. Remember, Alex, truth is rarely safe, but it's always necessary. When I left the office, the corridor seemed softer somehow, the light reflecting off the rain-speckled windows like small fragments of peace. I paused halfway down the hall, the book pressed against my chest, and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Something inside me had shifted. Not enough to erase the fear, but enough to make it bearable. That night, as the rain whispered against the glass of my dorm window, I opened the book. On the first page, in delicate handwriting, was a single line underlined in ink. To be known is to risk everything, but to never be known is to lose yourself. I closed the book slowly, the weight of those words settling into me. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel entirely alone. And though I couldn't yet see where this quiet understanding would lead, I sensed that the story I'd spent years hiding had just begun to unfold. The following weeks unfolded like the calm before a storm. On the surface, life at college appeared ordinary. Morning lectures, crowded hallways, the dull rhythm of assignments. But beneath that fragile normalcy, something darker began to stir. It started quietly, like a whisper passed between curious mouths, an untraceable hum of speculation that spread faster than truth ever could. I first sensed it in the cafeteria. Conversations paused when I walked by. A few faces turned away too quickly, their laughter dimming into forced silence. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the paranoia was just old fear resurfacing. But the pattern grew too consistent to ignore. The sideways glances, the sudden hush when I entered a room, the messages left unread by classmates who once smiled in greeting. It didn't take long to learn what had happened. Someone had overheard a fragment of conversation between Professor Walker and me when I'd stayed after class. Maybe they caught the word intersex, maybe just enough to twist into rumor. By the time it reached the ears of strangers, it had been reshaped into something unrecognizable. Half-truths and speculation layered with cruelty. Lily noticed before I said anything. One evening, she set down her laptop and looked at me across the room, her expression soft but serious. "Alex," she said quietly, "people are talking. I thought you should know." I forced a smile I didn't feel. "Yeah, I figured." Her eyes filled with sympathy, but not pity. "Do you want me to say something?" "No," I said too quickly. "It'll pass." But it didn't. The whispers only grew sharper. I began eating alone, avoiding the cafeteria altogether, lingering in the library until it emptied out. Even the air felt heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the gossip and exhaled judgment. I could handle being different, but being defined by that difference, being dissected by people who didn't understand, was another kind of pain entirely. One afternoon, in the middle of a group discussion, a classmate snickered as I spoke. "Guess that's not the only thing unusual about you, huh?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few to hear. The laughter that followed was quiet, restrained, but it was laughter all the same. I froze mid-sentence, every muscle stiffening, my voice caught in my throat. Professor Walker's eyes lifted from his notes, his expression instantly sharp. "Is there something amusing about the topic, Mr. Green?" he asked coolly. The boy stammered, shaking his head. "No, sir. Just a joke." "Then perhaps next time, you'll remember that humor requires intelligence, not cruelty," the professor said. The room went still. I wanted to thank him, but I couldn't. I sat there, cheeks burning, wishing I could shrink out of existence. After class, I gathered my things as quickly as I could. Professor Walker called my name, but I mumbled something about another appointment and hurried out. I didn't want to see the concern in his eyes. Kindness in moments like that felt too close to pity. Days bled into nights. My sleep fractured into restless fragments, my thoughts looping endlessly. Why can't they just leave me alone? Why did I ever tell anyone? I began skipping social events, withdrawing from the clubs I joined, keeping conversations short. Even Lily couldn't reach me sometimes. I hated that she tried, but I hated more that she cared. Then one evening, as I sat beneath the dim light of the library, a soft voice broke the silence. "You've been hiding in here for hours," Professor Walker said, appearing beside the table. I looked up, startled. "I'm just catching up on work." He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady. "You're not the only one who's ever felt the world closing in, Alex. The question is, what will you do with the space that's left?" His words carried the quiet gravity of experience. I didn't respond, but something in me loosened. He reached into his bag and placed a folder on the table. "I'm organizing a student project," he said. "It's about stories that challenge stereotypes, real voices, real experiences. I think your perspective could help." I stared at the folder. "You want me to talk about this?" "I want you to talk about truth," he said. "The rest is up to you." I didn't agree right away. The thought of standing in front of others, of exposing even a fraction of my reality, terrified me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I remembered something he'd said the first time we spoke. Sometimes the thing you think isolates you becomes the reason someone else feels seen. Maybe that was worth the risk. Over the next week, I began drafting ideas for the project. I wrote about invisibility, the strange kind that comes from being seen only for what others assume. I wrote about silence, about how it can be both armor and prison. And I wrote about courage, the quiet version that doesn't roar but whispers, "Keep going." Lily helped me rehearse in our dorm, sitting cross-legged on the bed as I stumbled through sentences. "You're shaking," she said gently after one attempt. "I'm terrified," I admitted. She smiled. "Good. That means it matters." On presentation day, the auditorium wasn't full, but it felt enormous. My palms were slick, my voice unsure at first. But as I spoke, something shifted. The tremor in my words softened into rhythm. The room hushed, not in mockery this time, but in listening. I told them about growing up feeling unseen, about learning to hide behind normalcy. I didn't use labels, didn't preach. I simply told the truth. When I finished, there was silence. Then slowly applause, soft at first, then louder, sincere. Professor Walker stood in the back, his expression unreadable but proud. Afterward, a few students approached me quietly. One girl said, "Thank you. My brother's different too, and people never understand. What you said, it helped." Another boy nodded without words, his eyes shining with something like recognition. Walking back to my dorm that evening, I felt something unfamiliar. Lightness. Not happiness exactly, but release. The whispers hadn't disappeared. Some people would still talk, but their words no longer carried the same weight. When I entered the room, Lily was waiting with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "You did it," she said, smiling. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But you did," she said. "And that's the part that matters." I sat beside her, the warmth of the mug seeping into my hands. Outside, the campus lights flickered against the night, soft and forgiving. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was shrinking beneath their glow. I felt seen, not as a rumor, not as a mistake, but as someone still becoming. As I drifted to sleep that night, I thought of the professor's words again, about truth, about necessity. Maybe acceptance wasn't something you found in others first. Maybe it began the moment you stopped apologizing for existing. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars of fear and rejection, I felt a quiet, steady conviction take root. This story, my story, was not meant to be hidden anymore. The days after my presentation felt strangely quiet, like the hush that lingers after a storm has spent its fury. The rumors had lost their edge, replaced by something softer, curiosity, perhaps even respect. For the first time since I arrived at college, I could walk through the courtyard without feeling like every eye was measuring me. Still, the silence that followed wasn't peace, not entirely. It was reflection, a new kind of stillness that left me face to face with emotions I hadn't dared to name. Lily had been there through it all, steady, patient, and maddeningly kind. She never demanded my gratitude or dissected my pain. She simply existed beside it, like a constant melody that didn't need to fill the silence to be heard. In her presence, I didn't have to explain myself. And that, I was beginning to realize, was a rare and dangerous kind of comfort. One evening, we found ourselves walking back from the library under a sky brushed with fading pinks. The air smelled faintly of rain, cool and sweet. Lily was talking about her journalism project, her words animated and bright, but my mind kept drifting. To the shape of her smile when she laughed, to the way she looked at me, without hesitation, without judgment. "You're quiet tonight," she said, glancing at me. I hesitated, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how strange it feels," I said slowly, "to not be hiding anymore. Like I'm learning how to breathe all over again." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "You've been holding your breath for a long time, Alex. It's okay if you don't exhale all at once." Her words hit deeper than she probably intended. We walked in silence for a while, the sound of our footsteps sinking against the damp pavement. When we reached our dorm, she paused by the door and said quietly, I'm really proud of you." It should have been a simple thing to hear. But the sincerity in her tone stirred something deep in me, something warm and terrifying all at once. I mumbled a thank you and hurried inside, pretending not to notice the way my heart had started to race. Over the next few weeks, our friendship deepened. We studied together, shared late-night snacks, and confided small secrets that built invisible bridges between us. Yet beneath the laughter and easy companionship, there was a quiet tension neither of us acknowledged. Sometimes, when the world outside our dorm faded away, the silence between us felt charged, like an unspoken truth hovering just out of reach. One night, during the first snow of the season, we sat by the window wrapped in blankets, watching the flakes swirl beneath the lamplight. Lily's hair glowed faintly gold under the soft light, and I found myself studying the curve of her profile, the way her eyes softened when she smiled. "I love nights like this," she said dreamily. "Everything feels slower, simpler." "Yeah," I murmured. "It's like the world finally stops pretending to be something it's not." She turned to me then, her gaze lingering. "Kind of like you." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "You've changed," she said. "You used to hide behind silence, like you were afraid of taking up space. But now," she smiled softly, "now you speak like someone who believes they belong here." I looked away, feeling the familiar heat rise in my chest. "Sometimes I still don't," I admitted. "Even now, there's a part of me that thinks I have to earn the right to be seen." "You don't," she said gently. "You just have to be." Her words were simple, but they felt like a hand reaching into the deepest part of me and pulling me into light. I met her gaze again, and something passed between us, unspoken but undeniable. The air felt different after that. Every touch, every glance carried a new weight. I started noticing the way her laughter lingered a second longer when I said something funny, or how her hand would brush against mine as we walked, neither of us pulling away. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was quiet, inevitable, like two rivers finding their way toward the same ocean. Still, I fought it. Love, to me, had always been something fragile, something I was convinced I couldn't have without conditions. The world had taught me that people loved what they understood, and I had spent most of my life being misunderstood. What if she saw me differently once the word intersex wasn't just a fact, but a part of someone she might love? The thought haunted me until one night it broke free. We were sitting across from each other, working on our laptops. The glow of the screen lit her face in pale blue light. Without meaning to, I blurted out, "Lily, can I ask you something?" She looked up, curious. "Of course. Do you ever think about what people would say if they knew more about me? About who I am?" She frowned slightly. "You mean about being intersex?" I nodded. She leaned back, studying me for a moment. "I think people already talk about you, Alex. They always will. But what they say doesn't matter as much as what you believe when you look in the mirror." "That's easy for you to say." "Is it?" she countered softly. "You think I don't see how brave you are? You stood in front of a whole room and told the truth. That's not something to hide behind. That's something to love." The last word hung between us, electric and tender. "Lily," I started, but she was already closing the distance, her voice low. "You don't have to explain what makes you worthy of love, Alex. You already are." I didn't move, didn't speak. The air felt fragile, as if one wrong breath might shatter it. But when her hand brushed mine, everything that had been uncertain suddenly felt inevitable. I didn't need to say anything, she already knew. We didn't cross any lines that night. There was no dramatic confession, no cinematic kiss. Just the quiet miracle of being seen and still chosen. We sat there, hands intertwined, while the snow fell outside, blanketing the campus in white silence. Later, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed her words over and over. "You don't have to explain what makes you worthy of love." It felt like the first time anyone had said something I truly believed. In the days that followed, nothing between us outwardly changed, yet everything had. Our friendship carried a new depth, a softness that lived in the spaces between words. She became my anchor in a world that still sometimes tilted beneath my feet. But as the semester edged toward its end, I couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of my mind, the one that whispered that peace, for me, rarely lasted long. Life had a way of testing the very things that made me feel safe. And though I didn't know it yet, the days ahead would force me to face that truth again. This time, with everything I'd come to love on the line. For now, though, as I drifted into sleep with the faint memory of her hand in mine, I allowed myself a fragile kind of hope. The kind that blooms in winter and survives only because it dares to. The winter thawed slowly that year, reluctant to surrender to spring. By the time the first buds appeared along the campus walkway, I had begun to feel something I hadn't known in years: stability. My days had shape again. Classes, laughter, quiet evenings with Lily, and the soft rhythm of life that no longer felt like performance. Yet beneath that new calm, I sensed a subtle shift approaching. Growth, I was learning, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as the next challenge. It came in the form of an email from Professor Walker. The subject line read, "Invitation to speak, Student Symposium." I opened it hesitantly. He was organizing a college-wide symposium on inclusion and human identity, inviting a handful of students to share personal narratives. "I believe your voice could reach further than you realize," he'd written. "Would you consider it?" My first instinct was to refuse. I had already faced enough eyes, enough whispers. To stand on a stage again, this time in front of the entire college, felt like volunteering to reopen every wound I'd only just begun to heal. I closed my laptop and stared out the window, the early sunlight glinting off the frost. The thought of saying yes terrified me, but the thought of remaining silent, that terrified me more. When I told Lily, she didn't push. She simply listened, tracing circles on her coffee cup. "You don't have to do it," she said softly. "But if you do, make sure you're doing it for you, not for anyone else's acceptance." Her words lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of the students who had come up to me after my last talk, their faces hesitant but grateful. Maybe, I thought, my story wasn't just mine anymore. Maybe it belonged to anyone who'd ever felt unseen. By dawn, my decision was made. I replied to Professor Walker with a single line: "I'll do it." The days leading up to the symposium passed in a blur of preparation. I wrote and rewrote my speech, deleting whole paragraphs when they sounded too polished, too distant. I didn't want to impress. I wanted to connect. Professor Walker met with me twice, reading drafts with quiet patience. "Don't chase perfection," he said once. "Truth isn't poetry, it's the heartbeat between words." When the day finally arrived, the auditorium shimmered with nervous energy. Students, faculty, and visitors filled the seats, murmuring in anticipation. I waited backstage, my pulse loud in my ears, palms slick with sweat. Lily was there, standing just behind the curtain. She squeezed my hand. "You'll be brilliant," she whispered. Then it was my turn. The lights were bright, the room vast. For a moment, I almost froze. But then I saw them, faces waiting, curious, expectant. And somewhere in the front row, Professor Walker nodded once, as if to say, "You belong here." I began quietly. I told them about growing up feeling invisible, about the years spent trying to fit into boxes that never quite closed around me. I spoke of the loneliness that comes from being known only in fragments. Then, slowly, I let the word out, the one I had once feared would undo me. Intersex. It landed softly, without shock, without pity. I explained what it meant, but more importantly, what it didn't, that it wasn't something to be fixed or pitted, but simply understood. As I spoke, the fear began to fade, replaced by something steadier, conviction. I looked across the room and saw students leaning forward, not out of morbid curiosity, but empathy. My voice grew stronger. I talked about the cruelty of silence, about how we spend years teaching ourselves to shrink to survive, and how survival alone is not living. I spoke about love, too, how I had learned it didn't require explanation or justification, how someone had shown me that being different didn't mean being unworthy. By the time I finished, the room was utterly still. For a moment, I wondered if I had gone too far, said too much. Then the applause began, soft, hesitant at first, then rising into something thunderous, unrestrained. I stood there, blinking back tears, unsure how to contain the swell of emotion inside me. Afterward, people approached me, students, professors, even strangers who'd come just to listen. Some offered words of encouragement, others simply nodded, their eyes saying what words couldn't. Among them was Professor Walker. "You found your truth," he said quietly, "and you gave others permission to find theirs." Lily found me outside, near the fountain where the water glittered in the late afternoon sun. She didn't say anything at first, just hugged me, tight and wordless. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "You did it, Alex. You turned everything they said would break you into something beautiful." I smiled against her shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Maybe not," she said, pulling back to meet my eyes, "but you were the one who stood up there alone." For the first time, I didn't feel the need to shrink from that truth. She was right. I had stood there, fully, completely myself, and the world hadn't ended. It had, in some small way, opened. The semester ended soon after, and with it came graduation. Standing in line with my classmates, cap balanced awkwardly on my head, I felt the strange ache of endings, the sweetness and sorrow of leaving behind the place that had broken and rebuilt me. When my name was called, I walked across the stage, and for once, I didn't worry about what people saw when they looked at me. I knew. After the ceremony, Professor Walker approached, offering a small envelope. "A letter," he said, "from one student of life to another." I opened it later that night. Inside was a note written in his careful handwriting. "You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing honesty despite it. Never stop choosing." I read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it inside the same journal I'd brought with me on my first day. The one that had once held nothing but doubts now brimmed with pages of truth. In the weeks that followed, as students drifted home for the summer, I stayed a little longer. The campus, once crowded and loud, grew quiet. I would walk the familiar paths in the evening light, feeling the world settle into stillness. I often thought of how different I was from the person who had first arrived here, scared, silent, desperate to disappear. That version of me had believed survival was enough. Now I wanted more. I wanted to live without apology. On my final night before leaving, I sat by the same window where it had all begun, the mirror reflecting the city lights, half shadow, half glow. I opened my journal and wrote a final entry. If you're reading this someday, remember, there is no shame in being different. The world will try to name your worth, but only you can define it. Tell your story, even if your voice shakes. Because somewhere, someone is waiting to breathe easier because you did. I closed the journal, smiling to myself. Outside, the stars flickered like promises, quiet, distant, and endlessly real. And for the first time, I felt entirely whole, not because the world had accepted me, but because I had accepted myself. That was enough. That was everything.